Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk.
Micah and then,
Nahum,
what's the chapter?
Chapter 2. The context.
It says the Lord's hands.
Yeah, it's probably good to start in verse 2 to get the context. Then the Lord answered me and said, record the vision and inscribe it on tablets, that the one who reads it may run. For the vision is yet for the appointed time. It hastens toward the goal. It will not fail. Though it tarries, wait for it, for it will certainly come. It will not delay. And so it's referencing a future time. Behold, as for the proud one, his soul is not right within him. But the righteous will live by his faith. And of course, the proud one will not. But there are 3 references to that scripture in the New Testament. They're in Romans 1:17, I think, where Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God and salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it is revealed the righteousness of God from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. And in Galatians, I think it's chapter 3, quotes it, and then also Hebrews.
No, that's a paraphrase, though, then I guess, because he said, live by his.
Yeah,
his
it
faith.
inserts the word his, but I think in the original Hebrew of it, that word his
Is in the
there.
Roman letter.
Now, I don't know if Kent has taught you about this, but the quotations in the New Testament of the Old Testament are often, maybe almost always, from the Septuagint version, which was a translation from Hebrew into Greek, done roughly 250 BC in Alexandria, Egypt.
It's very similar Greek to the New Testament, Koine Greek.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's it's like when Paul tells Timothy, you had the scriptures and stuff. He's probably talking about, they probably had the Septuagint, is probably what they were reading.
Yeah, that's the Bible of Jesus' day, and Jesus used that. Even though a lot of the people in that culture in that day spoke Hebrew and Aramaic, they relied heavily on the Septuagint.
So they would they be speaking in Aramaic or Hebrew, and then when they came to a scripture, they would quote it in the Koine Greek?
Well, Aramaic was familiar to the Jews ever since the Babylonian captivity. Aramaic is very similar to Hebrew language. But when Alexander came along in 400 BC roughly, he forced everybody to learn his language and culture. And so it was sort of illegal to use other languages. They may have done it in their homes or in private settings, but publicly and in writing, they would have spoken Greek.
The Greek was the American English of the time, basically. Like everybody spoke Greek. Like you might know Aramaic also, but you knew Greek. It's like if you're going to learn a language, you're going to learn Greek. And so it was the New Testament and what was written in the language that pretty much everybody knew, everybody understood. And so it makes sense that the Bible, if they're quoting it, would be like, I'm not going to quote you guys the Greek, even though I might be able to pull it up or something. I'm going to quote you the ESV translation in English. Now, is that the Bible? Well, yeah, but there might be some translational discrepancy, but we're functionally using the English. And so I think that's pretty much what was going on in the first century. They're reading the Bible, they're reading it in the common language. They might have had access to the original Hebrew somewhere.
So you said that his was inserted in Habakkuk.
I believe, if I remember right, I did look at that one time. I've got a what do you call it? It's an interlinear that has the Greek and the New Testament, but it's got the Hebrew and the Old Testament with the English words. And I looked in Habakkuk and I found that in the Hebrew, it did have the word his. The just shall live by his faith.
So then
Yeah.
Paul left it out then.
Well,
He
his
did
point
in
is-
2 places, but I think he inserted it in 1 place
Oh,
in
okay.
Greek.
His point is that Paul's quoting the Septuagint.
Yeah.
You know, and so the Septuagint's a translation of the
Oh,
Hebrew.
and the Septuagint
no-
didn't have the.
That's why a lot of times you'll see slight variations from the New Testament quote in the Old Testament, because what generally, like what ESV is going to do is they're going to look at the Masoretic text or the Dead Sea Scrolls or some Hebrew text of the Old Testament. They're going to look at the Septuagint too, but they might say, well, this is the translation of the original, or the New Testament will just be a direct quotation of the Septuagint, which may or may not be identical. Like they won't, like some translations will say Yahweh or Jehovah, the Tetragrammaton, or the Septuagint said Kyrios, the Lord. And so in the New Testament, they'll quote the same passage over here. Well, this one will say Jehovah, this one will say the Lord. And so they're quoting out of the Greek Bible that they have. They're
Right, so if
quoting-
it said Jehovah in the Old Testament, it would say the Lord in the New Testament because it's
Exactly.
Kyrios in the Greek.
Exactly.
Okay.
So we're kind of deviating a little bit here.
All right. Anyway, so then
Fine.
so it says to live by faith in 3 places. You said it's in Galatians and Romans and.
It just seems like it's a theme. It would make sense that the same author who did it in Romans and in Galatians would do it.
Well, I'll take that one as the Huckleberry.
Huckleberry.
That's the last nail in a coffin.
All right, so we're going to blow through audience because it's kind of the same point. It's anonymous. It doesn't say to the saints who are in Ephesus, to the saints who are in Philippi. It just starts God in many ways in previous days, as spoken by the prophets. So he doesn't tell specifically, although he does give little clues there at the end. He talks about Timothy. He talks about those in Italy, sending greetings. So we don't really know specifically, but what we do know is that they're of Hebrew descent. They're Jews. If for no other reason, right there in chapter 1, verse 1, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. Whose fathers did he speak to by the prophets? The Jews. And there's an understood understanding of the Old Testament throughout the whole letter. So it's like more than any other book of the New Testament. It seems to make sense it's spoken to Jews.
So he's like, yeah, you guys know what I'm talking about in this part where it says this.
Right.
He doesn't. He's not saying like.
So that's it's anonymous, but we know that they're Jews, whoever they are. Some people think that he was writing actually to the Christian Jews within the city of Jerusalem. Some think it was a circular letter to the 12 tribes, like 2 Peter was and James was. But
I don't know where I got this from, but someone was saying that it was like an oration originally, like it was like a speech basically, and that it was just recorded, but he was like whoever Paul was like going around speaking it to people or something. Have you ever heard that?
I haven't heard that, but I mean, I could see that being.
I heard that it was like a sermon, or it maybe was a sermon. But I don't know, the amount, the quantity, it would take longer than a typical sermon.
Yeah.
Weren't people falling asleep at his sermons though? Falling out of windows,
I
so.
think it took me over an hour to just read it. It took a long time to read it. I definitely almost fell asleep. Actually, I think I didn't fall asleep.
So it's important to understand he's talking to Jews, but I would say more important than that, and one thing that has led to some of the misunderstanding I think that's out there on the book of Hebrews is the second point, is the fact that he's talking to Jews who are believers. He's not talking to unconverted Jews saying, you guys need to accept this Jesus. He's over and over again saying, you need to hold fast to your confession. You need to stay holding on to the one that you already believe in. He calls in chapter 3, verse 1, he calls them his holy brethren. Something you wouldn't say to the unconverted. And so it kind of raises some eyebrows. A lot of the warning passages in Hebrews can be very severe, and people say, well, that couldn't possibly be to a believer. But you'll notice whenever he does that, whenever the author is saying, but we need to take care lest such and such happen, it's always in the first person plural, we. So if you're saying, okay, well, we think this is talking to unbelievers, the author is including himself in those warnings. So to me, that's pretty ironclad argument that this is addressed to believers. They're warnings that are to people who have made a genuine profession, not false professors, or not Jews who are kind of, on the fence about whether they believe Christ or not. They're genuine believers. And so that kind of lays a groundwork for, as we're studying, when it comes to a passage like, wait a minute,